Rudolph Anderson, Jr. was born in Spartanburg, South Carolina on September 15, 1927. His parents were Rudolph Anderson and Mary Barksdale Anderson, and his older sister was Mary Elizabeth. His parents moved to Greenville, South Carolina, when Anderson was just a young child. In his childhood, he would build model airplanes, as you can see in this picture here, and fly them around his yard, and thinking of a time when he would one day actually take to the skies himself. He would tell everyone that flying airplanes was what he wanted to do when he was grown. He loved to ride his bike around town and enjoyed fishing, and was a member of the Boy Scouts and was devoted to his church. He also spent time at Cleveland Park when he was a young boy, playing in the park, and that's the very park that would one day honor him with a memorial. As a young boy, Anderson was well thought of and always seemed concerned for the well-being of others. His principal at Augusta Circle Elementary said of Anderson, "He was an outstanding boy, a very likable person, and a very good student." Now, he attended Augusta Circle Elementary School in Greenville, finishing up there in 1939. The school itself is still there, still active, still being used. After Augusta Circle Elementary School, Anderson attended Greenville High School and graduated in 1944. He was involved in many school activities, including being a member of the Model Airplane Club. Staying in form, his senior quote in the 1944 Greenville High Yearbook read, "Good humor is the clean blue sky of the soul." While he was in high school, Anderson learned to fly, and when he had the money, he would rent planes to practice flying at every opportunity. After high school, Rudy attended Clemson University, where he majored in textile engineering and was a member of ROTC and participated in many other activities. Before his senior year at Clemson, Anderson attended Air ROTC summer camp at Keesler Field in Mississippi. Anderson graduated from Clemson in 1948 and went to work at Judson Mill in Greenville, South Carolina. Now, at the time, Greenville was known as the textile capital of the world. Anderson was only at Judson Mill for a couple of years, and the Air Force called him to active duty in 1951 during the Korean conflict. 2 years later, Anderson graduated from flight school. Anderson was assigned to the 15th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron in Kempo, Korea. He flew the RF-86 Sabre jet that had a maximum speed of 700 miles per hour, which became his favorite plane to fly. He flew surveillance missions over Korea and Japan during this time. In 1955, Anderson was flying reconnaissance missions over Taiwan because of threats from Communist China. He was a first lieutenant by this time, and he earned the Distinguished Flying Cross in 1955. He earned another Distinguished Flying Cross, this being designated by an oak cluster just a few months later. In the spring of 1955, Anderson was stationed at Larson Air Force Base in Washington State. Here he also flew the RF-84 Thunderflash. This was a reconnaissance plane as well as a light tactical bomber. U-2s were developed in the mid-1950s, and they were designed to fly at 70,000 feet, which at that time had never been done. The planes were built for reconnaissance because they could fly at such high altitudes. It was thought that they could fly well out of reach of Soviet missiles, radar, and fighter planes. Because of the altitudes they would be flying, pilots had to start breathing pure tank-based oxygen 1 hour before flight. In 1958, an elite group of pilots were selected for training in what was called the Dragon Lady program. Anderson was one of these elite pilots chosen. From April to July of 1958, Anderson flew with Project Crowflight. This was a high-altitude program that was designed to collect air samples to measure gases released during plutonium production. Anderson received his first Air Force Air Medal for this assignment. Next, Anderson flew the U-2 craft in Operation Fortune Finder. He earned his second oak leaf cluster to the Distinguished Flying Cross for this assignment. In the early 1960s, Anderson was attached to the 4080th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing at Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas. By this time, Anderson had over 3,000 flight hours, and over 1,000 of these hours were in the U-2. Beginning in the summer of 1962, maritime shipments from Russia to Cuba saw a steady increase. Because of this, the United States increased the surveillance of these activities. So, beginning October 14, 1962, Major Richard Hazer and Major Rudolf Anderson began flying surveillance missions over Cuba in what was called Operation Brass Knob. It was on October 14, 1962, that Major Hazer took the first photos showing that Cuba did indeed have medium-range ballistic missile installations. Further surveillance missions by Hazer and Anderson confirmed the buildup of nuclear missile sites, and so began a 13-day standoff between the United States and Russia that came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And also, the missiles that Russia had provided Cuba had the capacity to devastate a large portion of the United States, so it became a real concern for the country and President Kennedy. In the meantime, from October 17th to the 27th, 9 other pilots joined Hazer and Anderson in these surveillance flights. There is evidence that on October 25th, U-2 pilot Captain Gerald McElmoyle was fired on as he flew over Baines, Cuba. On Saturday, October 27th, 1962, at 8:10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Major Anderson took off from McCoy Air Force Base in Florida on what would turn out to be his final flight, and a flight that would change the course of history. Major Anderson was not scheduled to fly on this day, but he requested to fly the next mission. The mission was to last about 3.5 hours. Around noon on October 27, 1962, on orders from Soviet military officials and encouragement from Cuban leader Fidel Castro, Major Anderson's plane was fired on. It has been said that the Soviet officials on the ground in Cuba were not directed to fire on U.S. planes, but did so on their own accord. Major Anderson was flying at approximately 72,000 feet when 2 surface-to-air missiles, also known as SAMs, exploded near his plane. Anderson died after shrapnel from the exploding warheads punctured his flight suit. His U-2 plane crashed in the jungle around Baines, Cuba, located on the island's eastern side. And if you remember, Baines, Cuba is where Captain McElmoyle was reported to have been fired on October 25th. Anderson's death was confirmed at 4 p.m. by General Maxwell Taylor, who then recommended that the United States should execute an air attack on the SAM site responsible for shooting down Major Anderson's U-2 plane. Discussions on what action should be taken by the United States were divided, and most everyone thought military action was unavoidable. There is no doubt that Major Anderson's death pushed the Cuban Missile Crisis to the brink. President Kennedy was encouraged by many of his advisors to respond militarily. Kennedy chose diplomacy because he knew any type of military action could and probably would lead to a nuclear World War III. Kennedy sent Nikita Khrushchev a strongly worded ultimatum that strong and retaliatory measures would be taken unless he received immediate notice that the missiles would be withdrawn from Cuba. Many historians believe that Anderson's death made both Kennedy and Khrushchev realize how close they were to nuclear devastation. In less than 24 hours, Khrushchev announced plans to remove the missiles from Cuba and thus ending the Cuban Missile Crisis. A few days later, Major Anderson's body was returned to the United States. The Swiss embassy handled the arrangements and flew his body to Miami. A Boeing 707 was waiting and flew Major Anderson's body to Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. The Boeing 707 was one of 3 planes designated as an Air Force One plane. The next day, the very same plane flew Major Anderson's body to Donaldson Air Force Base in Greenville, South Carolina. Anderson's wife and parents were present to receive the body. Major Rudolf Anderson, Jr. was buried with full military honors in Woodlawn Memorial Park in Greenville, South Carolina, on November 6, 1962. Major Anderson was married to Frances Jane Corbett Anderson and was the father of 2 boys and 1 daughter. Major Anderson was the only combat fatality of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and many people believe that his death was a major factor, if not the factor, in the United States and Russia understanding how very close they were to nuclear war, and this caused both sides to reach a compromise. After his death, Major Anderson was the first recipient of the United States Air Force Service Cross. This is Major Anderson's grave, located in Section S at Woodlawn Memorial Park in Greenville, South Carolina. His grave is very easy to find. Once you locate Section S, his grave is right across from the tower. The tower is a landmark of the cemetery, and you can't miss it. The Major Rudolf Anderson, Jr. Memorial was dedicated on May 19, 1963, at Cleveland Park. The park is located in Greenville, South Carolina. On the 50th anniversary of Anderson's death, October 27, 2012, the memorial was rededicated and features many updates. It now has storyboards that tell the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis with illustrations and images of the event. The jet featured at the memorial is the F-86 Sabre, like the one that Anderson flew in Korea, and not a U-2 jet aircraft that he was flying when he was shot down over Cuba. At the time the memorial was built, the government did not have any surplus U-2s, so the F-86 was donated to the memorial. But it seems appropriate that the memorial features the F-86 because, as I mentioned earlier, it was said to be Anderson's favorite plane to fly. If you live in Greenville, or if you are visiting the area and have not seen the Major Rudolf Anderson Memorial, please take a few minutes to visit the site and pay tribute to this true American hero. He gave his life for his country and in doing so saved millions of lives and prevented World War III. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. I will have a new video out in a few days, and I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you for watching.